Hi, welcome to GeoStory. I'm Jared.
And I'm Callie.
And on today's episode, we're exploring continental divides. All right, Callie. So I'm driving through North Dakota. I got my Edward Grieg on.
You listen to Grieg when driving?
Oh yeah, all the time. So I'm driving along peacefully. And I see a sign that says Continental Divide. I'm thinking to myself, wait a minute. Did I fall asleep in geography class? I'm in the middle of the Great Plains that stretch from Edmonton to San Antonio, and some joker stuck a sign in the middle of a field proclaiming it to be the Continental Divide?
Are you even sure what state you were in?
Pretty sure I was in North Dakota. Well, as it turns out, I may have fallen asleep in just like one geography class because you don't have to head to Colorado to see the Continental Divide because there's more than one in North America. So I guess it's the Continental Divides. All right, Callie, let's set the record straight about North America. There isn't just one continental divide.
No, there's actually several of them in North America, including the one that you saw in North Dakota. And we'll talk about each one individually here in just a moment.
And here I've been just living in a fantasy world thinking that there's only one that went through Colorado.
You're right. The one that everyone is more familiar with is called the Great Divide, or the Continental Divides of the Americas. Perhaps this one is more well known because it happens to run through some of the most beautiful country in the Americas.
Okay, so let's break down how continental divides actually work.
So think of continental divides as a natural boundary, like a mountain ridge that separates water into different areas, acting as a drainage basin, but on a massive scale. So for the Great Divide, it runs from western Alaska down through North America along the crest of the Rocky Mountains. Then it weaves its way through Mexico until it finally reaches the tip of Chile. So if it rains on the west side of the divide, that water eventually rolls downhill to a stream or a river or a lake that continues draining all the way to the Pacific Ocean. Those same processes would occur for the water that falls on the east side of the divide, but that water eventually makes its way to the Atlantic Ocean. So essentially, this Great Divide separates the watersheds of the Pacific Ocean from those of the Atlantic Ocean.
Continental divides aren't just physical boundaries either. They were frequently used as political ones too. The Great Divide acted as the eastern boundary of Great Britain's claim to the Northwest until it was settled in 1849, and all British rights were withdrawn for the U.S. to take full possession of what is now Oregon, Washington, Idaho, and just a smidgen of Montana. The highest point on the entire Continental Divide is here in Colorado, not too far away from us right now, called Gray's Peak at 14,278 feet. Gray's Peak is one of the iconic 14ers in the state of Colorado, and if you're adventurous enough, you can hike right on up to the top.
In addition to Gray's Peak, there are multiple other places that you're able to visit along the Continental Divide. One of my favorite places is here in Colorado as well, called Independence Pass, which I have been to many, many times. The original name of Independence Pass was Hunter Pass in 1881. Now, funny story, B. Clark Wheeler in 1882, who was an entrepreneur and businessman in the area at the time, established a toll road on Independence Pass where he charged 25 cents for saddle horses and 50 cents for 2 horse wagons. No horse or quarter needed to visit these days. It is free and open to the public to drive up to the 12,090-foot pass.
There's a lot of great places to explore along the Continental Divide outside of Colorado. In the Bridger-Teton National Forest, you can hike to the Parting of the Waters, where the Two Ocean Creek splits into 2 channels. One goes east, connecting to the Yellowstone River, then to the Missouri and the Mississippi Rivers down to the Gulf of Mexico, and the westerly channel empties into the Snake River, and then into the Columbia and out to the Pacific. If you're heading south along the Continental Divide, you could stop in at Pie Town, New Mexico, which is famous for, yes, pies. They're having their 40th anniversary pie festival this year.
Oh, fun. In 1978, the Continental Divide Trail was added into the National Trails System Act and formed a hiking route that spans the entire 3,100 miles of the Continental Divide. This extensive trail traverses across multiple ecosystems, terrain, and remote landscapes. The Continental Divide Trail Coalition, who helps preserve and maintain the trail, describes the Continental Divide as a living museum of the American West. I just love this description. Now, about 150 people attempt to complete the end-to-end trek each year. Jared, what do you think? Should we do it?
Oh yeah, as soon as this quarantine is over, we're getting back out there. Now we've only touched on a few highlights along the Continental Divide, But just imagine the abundant history each town scattered along the divide has. From miners to explorers to frontiers people settling the West, all had to endure the journey across and through these tough landforms.
Now, we can't talk about the Great Divide without mentioning Lewis and Clark, who traveled across the Continental Divide into Idaho in 1805. The mission of their expedition was to trace the Missouri River back to its headwaters, and with any luck, find a water passage all the way to the Pacific Ocean. This would also serve to assert the Pacific Northwest as United States land, so that other European countries wouldn't try to claim the territory as their own.
On August 12, 1805, Meriwether Lewis wrote this about the Continental Divide. After refreshing ourselves, we proceeded on to the top of the dividing range, from which I discovered immense ranges of high mountains still to the west of us, with their tops partially covered in snow.
That's a good impression.
Thanks.
By crossing through Lemhi Pass, Lewis and his men became the first Americans to reach and negotiate the Continental Divide. The high point of the mountains meant that Lewis and his crew left United States territory and journeyed into Oregon country, the disputed lands claimed by Great Britain and the U.S.
However, Lewis gazed upon the snow-covered mountains from Lemhi Pass and realized that a water route to the Pacific was not feasible. Thus, a major component of the expedition was deemed a failure.
The expedition would still be a great success overall in scouting the Louisiana Purchase. Today, the Lewis and Clark Pass crosses the Continental Divide in the Helena National Forest. It's the only roadless pass on the Lewis and Clark Trail, so modern-day adventurers can retrace their steps on foot.
And so the next divide we want to talk about is the Laurentian Divide. The Laurentian Divide, or is also known as the Northern Divide, runs from Triple Divide Peak and Glacier National Park in Montana and winds its way east across the U.S. and Canadian border, toward the Great Lakes, then northeasterly to the border of Quebec, Newfoundland, and Labrador. Water that falls on the northern side of the divide finds its way to the Hudson Bay, and water that falls on the south joins with the Mississippi River and eventually cascades down to the Gulf of Mexico.
There's a sign for the Laurentian Divide up the Gunflint Trail where I grew up in Cook County, Minnesota. Growing up, I never really understood what the Continental Divide sign meant. So while Jared and I were home over Christmas, we drove up the Gunflint Trail to find the sign near Birch Lake. If you want to see a photo, feel free to swing over to our Instagram page.
So back in 1803, the Laurentian Divide marked the northern boundary of the United States after the Louisiana Purchase. In Canada, it marked the southern boundary of the fur trading monopoly held by the Hudson's Bay Company. Incorporated in England in 1670, Hudson's Bay Company dabbled in the fur trade for 2 centuries and remains an active corporation today, but has transitioned to the retail side of fur trading and is involved in other sectors such as real estate, merchandising, and natural resources.
As Jared mentioned, the Laurentian Divide would serve as the northern boundary of the United States until the 49th parallel was established in 1818. Essentially, the Treaty of 1818 was to settle boundary issues between the U.S. and British North America. It was decided that the 49th parallel would be the border line between the United States and what is now Canada. However, the physical geography of the land was not taken into account.
So why are divides still important today? Well, continental divides cross state and country borders, which can have political complications.
An example of this is the Northwest Area Water Supply Project, where North Dakota wanted to construct a water pipeline from Lake Sakakawea up and over the Laurentian Divide to reach 7 counties in the northeast corner of the state. Construction of the project started in 2002. However, the province of Manitoba filed a lawsuit immediately as they feared an inadequate environmental assessment was performed. Canadian parties were concerned about water quality, ecosystem integrity, water levels, and flow once the water crosses the divide. The lawsuit battle was drawn out for 15 years. The pipeline was eventually approved and construction was finally resumed just a few years ago in 2017.
Next, the third divide we're going to touch on is the Eastern Divide. The Eastern Continental Divide runs from the northern border of Pennsylvania down the Appalachian Mountains, then bisects Georgia and runs to the tip of the Florida Peninsula. To the west, water will flow and meet up with the Mississippi River drainage system to the Gulf of Mexico, while everything that falls to the east will make its way to the Atlantic Ocean.
The Eastern Divide is rich in history as well. Prior to about 1760, north of Spanish Florida, the Appalachian Divide represented the boundary between British and French colonial possessions in North America. It wasn't until 1763 that King George III issued what is known as the Proclamation Line of 1763 to prohibit colonists from settling further west. The Proclamation Line was set essentially along the Eastern Divide, the crest of the Appalachian Mountains. One purpose or objective of setting this line was for the British to keep its citizens within close proximity to the ocean, which was their lifeblood in regards to trade and maintaining the longevity of its empire. Another objective of setting this line was to reduce violence and continued wars with the Native Americans.
However, the Proclamation Line didn't fully succeed as settlers ignored the line and continued to sprawl west. There were colonists who were promised land out west for their military service after the 7-Year War and were upset that their opportunity to obtain land was now taken away from them. Even a young George Washington disregarded the line and continued to acquire land west, in hopes that if or when the Proclamation Line was nullified, that he would be ahead of the game as a successful landowner.
The Eastern Divide embodies an overwhelming amount of our United States history, and that history is etched in the landscape of the Appalachian Mountains. Just as the Continental Divide has a hiking trail that stretches the entire length, so does the Appalachian Mountains. The Appalachian Hiking Trail spans just shy of 2,200 miles.
The hiking trail was first proposed in 1921 by Benton McKay, but it wasn't until 1968 that President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the National Trails System Act into law, establishing the Appalachian Hiking Trail as a unit of the National Park System.
Since then, individuals from all over the world have come to immerse themselves in the Appalachian landscape. A number of people attempt to thru-hike the trail each year, spending on average 5 to 7 months hiking the 2,000-plus mile trail. Ages of hikers can range from people in their 20s to people in their 70s and even in their 80s. The oldest person to thru-hike the AT Trail was Dale Sanders at 82 years old, and it took him 7 months to complete the 2,190-mile trail.
Man, I better start working out if we're going to do all this hiking. Now that we've learned about North America's multiple continental divides, there's another geographical feature tied to these divides that we have to confess. We've been telling you that water will eventually make its way to oceans, and well, it's not always true. Sometimes water doesn't make it to the Pacific, Atlantic, or an ocean. These areas are called endorheic basins.
Endo what?
Endo what? Endorheic basins. I practiced that word for like days. Think of it as a valley where all the water flows in, but can't escape to an ocean or sea. It's just trapped there. Forever. The Caspian Sea is the largest example of an endorheic basin, but also think of the Great Salt Lake area and most of Nevada as being a low spot where water can't make its way to the Pacific. Endorheic basins can be small or large in size. Take, for example, Crater Lake in Oregon, where water is deposited by rainfall or small streams that trickle in, but the water remains contained within the lake or crater itself. The only way the water leaves is from evaporation.
Continental divides aren't just limited to North America. Each continent actually has their own continental divide, and we wanted to touch on a few key international divides. Africa's continental divide is known as the Congo-Nile Divide and runs 1,200 miles in length. It starts where the Congo, Chad, and Nile basins meet. It then runs southeast, then turns south to finally follow along the border of South Sudan and Uganda to the east, and the Central African Republic and Democratic Republic of Congo to the west.
Australia also has a divide called the Great Dividing Range, but it does not consist of one single mountain range. Instead, it is composed of a complex set of mountain ranges, plateaus, and escarpments that stretch 2,200 miles.
Essentially, every continent has a continental divide, and most have several. And just as our continental divides here are interwoven into the North American history, the continental divides internationally each have their own remarkable story and narrative.
Continental divides have served as barriers and boundaries for hundreds of years to native peoples and states alike. With growing populations and increasing water demands, they may still play an important role in the future.
If you want to know more about continental divides, check out the piece Continental Divides in North Dakota and North America by Mark Gonzalez in the North Dakota Geological Survey newsletter. We'll add a link in our bio along with websites for the trails we mentioned.
Thanks for listening. Do you have a geography question we can answer for you? What did you think of the show? Send us an email at geostorypodcast@gmail.com.
We've put some pictures up from our trip to the Continental Divide in Minnesota and along the Lewis and Clark Path in Idaho. To check these out Or if you've been to a Continental Divide, tag us or send us a picture. We're on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter under GeoStory Podcast. Thank you. See you next week.
Indariak.
Like Sakakawea.
I think you nailed it.
Sakakawea. I did. Oh my God.